Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Build a Sustainable Influencer Marketing Program from the Ground Up. I'm Alicia Esposito, Senior Content Strategist for Retail TouchPoints, and I'm really excited for today's presentation, which is a part of our Retail Reset program. As some or all of you may know, Retail Reset was created to create essentially a virtual forum where we bring together the best and brightest minds in retail to not only assess the current landscape, all of the new realities and uncertainties that we're facing as an industry, but offer some really practical tips, takeaways, and guidance in all areas of your business to really help you set a successful path forward. And I think, now more than ever, influencer marketing is especially relevant and especially powerful now that consumers are more and more relying on digital commerce, digital channels for researching and engaging with brands, and influencers are a really powerful way to connect with those new audiences. So really excited to dig into today's content with our speaker. And our speaker today is Allison Roy, and she is a Senior Digital Marketing Consultant at Capgemini's Digital Customer Experience Practice. She helps brands tell impactful stories through digital media and expand their reach through influencer marketing. Allison has provided strategic content marketing advice to B2C brands like Intermix, Havaianas, True Religion, Wilton, Radio Flyer, and more. Allison, from one content marketing person and digital marketing nerd, so to speak, to another, it's so great to have you on the program today, and really excited to break down some of the ins and outs of influencer marketing. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic off to you.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm so happy to be here today and really excited to dive into a deeper look at how to build and run a successful influencer marketing program. So just to kind of intro what we'll be talking about today, influencer marketing, everyone's been asking for years, is it going anywhere? Is it over? What will happen to it? And it's just been growing and growing as an industry. Yet still only a certain handful of companies do it well and do it thoughtfully. So today what I'd like to do is kind of break down the thought process and activities and strategies that go along with really building an influencer marketing program that can go the distance, especially in light of recent events right now. So just to look at what we'll be covering today, in order to show you how to run a successful influencer marketing campaign, we first have to break down the conversation into some bite-sized pieces. So here's a quick preview of what we'll be covering. First, we're going to talk about just the concept of influence. Who is an influencer? Who can wield it and why? And then building your campaign from the ground up. What is your story? Who are the right voices to tell that story and how to find them? And then from there, we can dive a little bit deeper into how to build really sustainable strategic partnerships with these people. We'll talk about figuring out what you need to ask from them and when. The size of the influencers that would be appropriate for your campaign, and then some of the finer details like payments and contracts, and also how to kind of go beyond just the social media posts and really get your influencer marketing materials to work for you. And then lastly, and maybe the most elusive question that I think influencer marketers have come across in recent times is how to measure the success of your campaign. So we're going to break this down into using key KPIs that can tell you how far your brand message traveled, how many leads you generated, which platforms and influencers are performing best, and where to go from there with those insights. So let's dive in. So one of the biggest questions I get from other marketers and clients as well is, will influencer marketing be around in the future? Is the bubble bursting? What does it really do? And to me, this signals that a lot of people don't fully understand the role of influence and how it can be flexed, who can flex it. So I think a really useful place to start is just a brief history lesson. So when you look at kind of the history of commerce, influencers have always been around, just in different capacities. You can go as early as the 1700s when a British potter received accolades from the Queen, and he used this to coin his line as Queenswear, which created the first luxury brand. So this is your first instance of where you see people wielding influence that drives commerce, and so that's royalty. And then you kind of fast forward a little bit past the Industrial Revolution, you now have brands, and you start to see brands leaning on other voices to help be more persuasive amongst consumers. So you see early days the use of characters like the Coca-Cola Santa Claus or Quaker Oats hard-to-please little boy called Little Mikey, and they use these people and characters and packaging to help give the brands a little bit more persuasive cachet. And then as we move into the 80s and 2000s and even current times, you see a trend towards relatability. In the 80s, you see collaborations between Nike and Michael Jordan and Pepsi and Cindy Crawford, and you can see them leaning on the influence of others to give their brand that heavyweight. And then as we move into more current times, we see trend towards celebrities, reality TV stars, and then what we have now is just kind of regular people. And the other types of influencers haven't gone away. We still see Meghan Markle selling, sustainable ballet flats. We still see characters that we love. We still pay attention to celebrities. But the trend in general is, looking for that trusted voice that can back a company. And that voice can come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes, which we'll be covering soon. But I think the overall takeaway here is to understand that people are looking for trustworthy voices that back the brand. And more than that, this is a concept that the industry in general is just continuing to invest in. So with influencer marketing growing and growing, we see certain trends that are really important to pay attention to. Companies are investing more in their own programs. We're also seeing improved ROI being reported just in general on influencer content. I believe the average ad spend that people are seeing an ROI on is up to $5.78 media value per $1 spent, a really interesting metric, I think, to note. We're also seeing continued consumer behavior trending towards consuming content on social media. I have this stat here that says 6 out of 10 people would rather watch online videos than television, so we know people are consuming that content online. But then we have additional studies that say things like 83% of Instagram users say they use that platform for product discovery. So, more and more we really need to spend effort, time, and resources on reaching consumers and getting them to connect with the products and services that your brand offers through social media. And even more interesting than that is an explosive growth of micro-influencers. At the outstart of what we know as traditional influencer marketing, it was all about the high reach, the influencers that had 100,000 to 1 million followers, working with celebrities like the Kardashians. And now we're seeing a more practical approach that's been proven out by brands that are using the smaller influencers that might be local. They might have less than 10,000 because they are the ones that are influencing that purchasing behavior. And so we'll be speaking more about working with smaller influencers in a little bit. So getting started, I want to break down kind of the thought process and the people that you can reach out to in order to structure your campaign around. This is really the understanding that brands need to utilize in order to build those sustainable platforms. Too many times I've seen clients or brands take the approach of beginning by saying, we need X amount of influencers to talk about our product or our brand, and that is what their campaign is founded on. But that problem doesn't start with the story, and it doesn't start with the right voices to tell the story. So let's just dive into who is an influencer. We know kind of the traditional tastemakers on social media. We've been seeing them for a long time, but what we're seeing a better trend towards lately is the utilization and building of a brand community. So a brand community consists of about 7 key players that do include influencers, but other types of voices as well. So you have brand ambassadors who are kind of like influencers, but generally smaller, and they work with brands on a longer term contract. They also are really closely aligned to the brand's values, whereas other influencers may just post a one-off feed post or something like that. You also have experts. That could be everything from healthcare professionals to leaders in the field that apply to your audience base. There are also affiliates. So anyone who's coming from a background of paid media is familiar with these commission-based brand partners. There's also creatives, partnering with people who do murals, who are illustrators or graphic designers or perhaps photographers to help create content on behalf of the brand and float on their channels. And there's also customers and employees, which I think are important contributors who shouldn't be overlooked. Customers create really valuable user-generated content, UGC, that should be reposted to the channels, to the brand's digital channels, and even, possibly be reached out to in order to create really relatable, real stories on behalf of the brand. And then in addition to that, employees. And we'll see some examples of this towards the end of the deck here, of companies who use the employees within their ranks to serve as brand evangelists on social media, and really advocate for both the digital experience and the in-store, really humanizing the brand. So let's just keep these folks in mind as we start to talk about what your brand campaign can look like.
Yeah, and this is Alicia. I think this really shows how much the influencer space has evolved, which is fantastic because I feel like for so long, in the earlier days especially, it seemed like, an initiative largely for brands with really big budgets, ones that could, reach out to these really well-known names. I mean, even the early stage fashion bloggers seemed like the bigger they got, the more untouchable they got for those smaller brands. So this really showed how diverse this pool has gotten, which is fantastic. But looking at this through the lens of a marketer or a person responsible for building out these programs, I could imagine that a lot of people are thinking, okay, like this is a lot for me to choose from. So how do we go about building out these programs in a way that is relevant to not just our brand, but for our customers as well, right? Because kind of selecting who you engage with really relies on them too, right? So what do we go through next?
That's such a great point. Yeah, it can be overwhelming when you think about how many opportunities there really are in this space. So to your point, we talked about those 7 key players that you can lean upon. Let's just leave that in the background for now. We want to revisit that later when we know what we want to say. And just perfectly to your point, Alicia, that's where we want to begin. We want to begin by figuring out what the brand needs to say. There's also a difference between what the brand needs to say, what they want to say, and what consumers need from the brand. So I like to start that here. So this is on the deck here on this image. It's kind of the thought process I like to apply to influencer marketing. You start with what problem are you trying to resolve, either for the brand or for the consumer. Perhaps the brand has a line that they need to highlight, they need to draw awareness to it. Perhaps a consumer needs something from the brand. Perhaps they need, help solving an issue, and that's where you've seen some of the meal planning apps using influencers to tell the story on behalf of them, and so you really want to think about what your goal is. And then once you know what goal you want to address with your influencer marketing campaign, you want to think about the execution of this right at the get-go. Who's handling the outreach, who's driving it, and what is your budget? Have those things in place before you go any further. You'll definitely want a key person, one person to spearhead these relationships because they'll need to be maintained over time. And then once you have those basic things in place, you can move on to your story. So you know what pain point you want to resolve. So what's the story that you need to tell in order to explain that to your audience? And who's the hero of the story? And that will help you kind of zero in on who needs to tell that story for you. If you create, home cooking tools, perhaps the home cook or a mom or a dad is your hero, and that will help you figure out what kind of influencer you need. And when you figure out kind of the type of media you want to use to tell that story, you know what platform works best for you. Do you need longer form videos that can click straight through to a product page link or a landing page link, and maybe YouTube's the right choice for you? Or do you want content generated on a highly visual platform that you can then turn into really effective paid social ads, and Instagram is the right choice for you? So, think critically about what kind of media you want to ask them to create for you. And as you're doing this, try to keep in mind in the back of your head your key KPIs. So, knowing what your goal is it driving traffic? Is it brand awareness? Is it conversions? This will point to the KPIs you need to pay attention to, track, and measure over that period of time to know whether or not your campaign is successful. There's a lot of different metrics that you can look at with influencer content, and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. But if you know your focus, then you know the most important ones to zero in on and quantify. And lastly, once you have your goal and your story and your hero and your platform selected, you can then figure out who you want to reach out to serve as voices that will amplify that brand message. And so when doing that, you want to think about your budget, the influencer size that's ideal for your storytellers. Do you want to work with macro influencers, maybe something more mid-tier, or do you want to recruit, you know, a team of brand evangelists in the form of brand ambassadors? And once you know who you want to reach out to, you'll know what kind of value proposition to share with them. Once you have that list of people you'd like to collaborate with, you need to figure out what you can offer them. And that is a value proposition. And that can be anything from financial compensation to focusing on product benefits to maybe sustainability or philanthropic messaging. But you know, these are content creators who are treating this as their full-time job, and there's a lot of competition in this space. So the last missing link here is to know, you know, what is that hook that's going to convince them to work with your brand. And really, before we move on here, we can't move on without addressing how this process applies to those of you who are kind of getting ready to launch an influencer campaign that was maybe drafted up before you know, current events, and a lot of things have changed and are constantly changing in this sphere. So just some notes on how you can stay agile and stay on top of things. You know, I really encourage all of you to revisit the content that you plan on launching this year and think about how it aligns to kind of the current climate that we're seeing on social media. So I included some questions here for you to take away with you to really consider what kind of value you're bringing to your consumer community. And I really recommend prioritizing above all that value that you're delivering over the bottom line that you're trying to meet if you really want to engage authentically with consumers who might be extra sensitive to what their brands are posting online. So, you know, think about what your current goal is. Is that still a goal for you? What problem are you solving, and what value are you delivering? And then also thinking about it on the flip side, you know, as a brand, you know, you immediately automatically understand the value that you are trying to bring and trying to deliver, but then try to hop into the shoes of the people receiving your content who need to be persuaded to buy from your brand. Will they perceive it as valuable? And also stay in those shoes to evaluate whether or not your messaging could be seen as tone deaf. Evaluate the models you're using, the messaging you're using, and the timing that you're posting. And then above all, really consider how you're adding value to the community. Go above and beyond what your brand story is, and consider perhaps a philanthropic approach, or just sharing more information about the leadership of your company, and try to connect on that level with your followers. Okay, so now we're at the fun part of trying to find the right influencers, the right voices for your brand. I like to kind of divide this process into 3 key parts. The first part's pretty basic. You are searching for the right people to speak about your brand. You already know what platform you want to work on, so you can start really simply by looking at low-hanging fruit. Look at recent tags. Who's tagging your brand? Who's talking about it? Which, you know, brand evangelist consumers can you reach out to see if they would be willing to create some content for the brand? That's a great kind of low-cost method of finding your first influencers. You can also search relevant hashtags, and whether or not that's a branded hashtag that belongs to your company, or just other things that have to do with brand values, like, you know, for example, veganism, or, you know, more fitness-related hashtags if you're an athletic brand. And see who's creating really interesting content in those spaces, in those conversations. Another route that you can go is taking a look at other brands that align with your values and seeing who they're working with, and evaluate whether or not some of their partners might be a good fit for you. And again, that emphasis is on non-competitive, because you don't want to be working with someone who is also actively promoting your competitor. And then there's also the option of relying on influencer marketing tools, and there's a ton on the market. You know, I think they deliver a lot of the same value of what you can accomplish on your own. They just streamline the process and give you an organized platform for keeping all of your information together. So, you know, if you are kind of strapped for time, but you have a decent sized budget to support your influencer marketing program, then you might want to invest in a tool that will help you access some of those stats around influencers like engagement rate or content quality. But if you don't want to divert too much of your budget to using a tool, which can be expensive, then everything that tool delivers can be handled on your own or through an agency partner. So that brings us to evaluating the content. You really do need a human eye to figure out whether or not this influencer, this content creator is right for your brand. And these bulleted lists here are things that you can start with to help kind of figure out if they're the right choice. You can look at their content quality and ask yourself, do they create images or videos that I would be proud to repost to my brand's channel? You can also look at their reach and see, is their audience size big enough? Engagement rate is a tricky one. It used to be the gold standard that you would look to make sure that, the influencer is receiving authentic engagement from their communities, but you need to be careful with this because we've seen influencer fraud cases kind of on the rise within the last kind of year and a half. And other third-party vendors who supply robot followers are getting smarter and more advanced, and now people can purchase likes, they can purchase video views and comments. So you're going to want to take a look through those comments to make sure that they're not too spammy, and also just to kind of take a look at the other conversations that they're having to make sure their values are in alignment with your brand's, and you'd be happy having them kind of serve as your spokesperson. And this is kind of where my role comes into play with clients, is where I can kind of help take that human element into the evaluation process and really take a critical human eye to what these influencers are creating and make sure they're the right fit for the brand. So now say you found a bunch of people that you're really excited about collaborating with, you kind of have to figure out how many people you can work with based on that budget that you set at the very beginning. So, the one thing I advise caution against is putting all of your eggs in one basket, and that would be working with 1, 2, or 3 big macro influencers who are super expensive, and perhaps you've never worked with them before and you don't quite know exactly what kind of results they're going to deliver. So I definitely caution against that. It's kind of a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people who are new to influencer marketing, and advise more of that kind of mid-tier strategy that includes a mix of smaller to larger influencers. And if you're really just gung-ho on getting that one really big million-follower Instagrammer on your roster, then this is what I like to call a queen bee strategy, where perhaps you have 1 or 2 really big influencers if your budget allows for it, and then comprise the rest of it with those nano and mid-tier influencers to give yourself a mix. This helps you diversify your list and is a little bit more of an economical strategy to help you reach multiple audiences. Okay, so building strategic partnerships. We've selected the right people, and now we need to figure out what we need to ask them to create. This is a critical point in your campaign process where you really should think before you reach out to them, what you would like them to create and what you would like to happen as a result of them creating content for you. Okay, so the goal of any influencer campaign should be to create not only just content, but content that's designed to perform. So ideally at the beginning of your process, as we talked about before, you've already come up with your marketing message, you know what goal you're trying to hit, and where that message is going to be broadcasted across. So when you're communicating with your influencers, the very beginning of that communication is the time when you need to discuss things like deadlines, knowing when is the pitching process, when is the negotiation process, when influencers have space for trial and content creation, and then if you need to build in, a review process before publishing, know that in advance going into your outreach so that you can effectively communicate that to your content creators that you're pitching. Share that timeline with them. And when you're thinking about what to ask from your influencers, cater to their skill set. If you notice that you need a video, or you're looking for a mix of video and, static photos, make sure that you're asking people who have a demonstrated skill set in video creation to create your video content for you, and et cetera. A brief is something that's really helpful for that. So if you are at the beginning of a campaign or you're at the beginning of launching your program for your brand, I would spend some time creating a brief that you can share with influencers that explain everything from expectations around deadlines to what kind of content you want them to create, to what hashtags you need them to have, and parameters, maybe things that they shouldn't be mentioning or language they should avoid. All of that should go in that brief, and leave enough room for that creative flexibility for them as well. But they are looking for feedback from brands when it comes to storytelling. They want to deliver content that you want so that you'll continue to work with them. But for brands that are less experienced in the space, I'd like to encourage them to seek feedback from people they'd like to work with. If you are new to influencer marketing, don't be afraid to engage them in a conversation. Do it old-fashioned style, get them on the phone, and ask them, for some ideas of things that they think would really resonate well with their audience, especially if you're looking to appeal to a brand new audience. Seeking feedback and having a real conversation is a great way to build a strong bond with your influencer.
This is great, Allison. Before we move on, you noted to or advise listeners to almost not put all their eggs in one basket, especially early on in the process. But again, going back to that vast list of potential influencers, I mean, what is the best way for everyone listening to best prioritize or determine where they should focus their time and attention early on? I mean, I'm sure it varies based on goals, budget, things like that. So are there any quick hacks or quick ways to figure out where they should prioritize?
I'm so glad you asked that. Let's dive into that question a little bit deeper. Okay, so this is a great question, Alicia, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to that, but there are, some strategies that you can take to make sure that you're creating maximum impact on the budget that you have been allocated. So something that's been gaining traction in more recent times is the concept of brand ambassadors. For the longest time, it's been all about influencers and large influencers, but as influencer marketing as a practice, as an industry develops, we're noticing more persuasive influence among smaller Instagrammers or smaller social media personalities who have that tight-knit following and who can really speak authentically to their love for a brand. So, when we're looking at those large influencers that you've seen that are basically models, you might notice that they'll post about a brand once and you'll never see it again. And while that may generate some really great content and kind of immediate brand awareness, it may not work as long-term as collaborating with a smaller influencer who loves your brand, who is willing to collaborate with you, for a smaller amount, smaller fee over several months. So I put together this kind of very simplified thought process to help guide you in terms of what size influencer, what type of campaign might be right for you. So first, I'd like to distinguish between what are brand ambassadors and what are influencers on a more granular level. When you look at brand ambassadors, they are chosen because, one, they love the brand a lot and they are willing to talk about it enthusiastically on their own channels versus just being paid to because it's a content creation contract. They also espouse values that align directly with the brand. So let's take Outdoor Voices, which is a sustainable athleisure company, for example. If you see Outdoor Voices from one influencer that posts about a bunch of different brands that may not be linked to sustainability, that's definitely an influencer play. But you'll also notice that they collaborate with lots of different, environmentally focused influencers who have smaller followings under maybe 10,000 followers, who consistently post about the brand, who attend, panels and events hosted by the brand, and you see them discussing Outdoor Voices on their channels, season after season, and those are brand ambassadors. And the perk to using those guys and to collaborating with them and creating strong relationships with them is that you have a stronger voice backing your product. You have that element of having that influencer type personality who, is posting the great content, but you also have someone who can speak a little bit more skillfully to your brand and represent it as somebody in-house might want it to be. So these are just some of my ideas. You definitely can invest a larger budget in brand ambassadors if you'd like. If we think about kind of what this might have looked like last year versus this year, you would see events, you would see maybe tours, that are added as kind of a way to sweeten the deal with your brand ambassadors. What that looks like now is probably a lot more, Zoom events, but the idea is that you're building community where your brand ambassadors talk to each other and are really held close to the brand versus influencers who are more employed by the brand and have a little bit more of a distant relationship. And on that note of what brand ambassador relationships can look like now versus, maybe prior times, I understand that a lot of marketers may have had their budget reduced or are just trying to kick something off with a smaller budget. So there are definitely ways around working with brand ambassadors if financial compensation is an issue. If there are any nonprofits listening in, this especially applies to you. In lieu of compensation, you can offer, exclusive Zoom events, invite a really great speaker and get them on your roster and have them kind of host something special with your brand ambassadors. Even if you're in the wellness space, like a hosted group meditation, give them something special to access. You can also share, gifts. If there's brand swag or additional products you can share, that's a way that you can go. And then something that I think would really resonate with brand ambassadors and the community in general is a donation to your ambassador's charity of choice. So perhaps your budget doesn't allow for, their fee structure that they would normally ask for, but perhaps, if they love the brand enough, a donation to their charity, even if it's smaller, might be enough for them to be willing to collaborate. Okay, so some of the trickier kind of hot topics that I wanted to bring up before we really dive into the content that you can create and how to measure it are these questions about the fine print. I get so many questions from clients about contracts and payments that I thought we just need to put this in this conversation today. So I want to start with the question of whether or not you need a contract. Contract creation can be kind of intense, especially if perhaps your legal department is small or on a contractual basis. Perhaps your advisor is not in-house. Contracts can pose kind of a daunting issue if you're approaching them for the first time with your influencers. I would say that whether or not you need a contract depends on your level of commitment. If you're just asking for a one-off Instagram post from somebody, chances are that a written agreement via email is probably enough. But if you are asking for, a large, complicated delivery of content over a long period of time, or perhaps you're working with personalities that might be a little bit more volatile, if you're working with different celebrities or controversial social media personalities, you might want to consult with your legal department, and a contract would likely be a better place to start for you with them. If you are a brand that is new to this process and you're working with smaller influencers, it's okay to ask them for guidance, ask them what they use or what other brands have shared with them, or if they have a template for you to take a look at, it's okay to ask them for guidance. So with that question, it all boils down to the level of commitment. Smaller commitments, you can likely get away without it, and larger, more intricate commitments, I would recommend having one. And that brings us to payment. When influencer marketing first kicked off years ago, people were really excited to talk about brands that they love and weren't necessarily expecting compensation. But things have kind of changed. Becoming an influencer is now an actual full-fledged career path for many people. I just saw a recent study by TouchPoints that said that about 70% of influencers chose to become content creators in order to earn revenue. So this is a job for most of the people that you'll be talking to in this field. So I would recommend treating them as an extension of your brand, as a business partner, and expect to be asked for financial compensation in exchange for the content and reach that they provide. If you're not quite sure where they are at with that, if you are working with those mid-tier influencers who may not be as established, you can ask whether or not they have a media kit first and see if they have pricing information up front, and that can help kind of guide your decision. And if you are just trying to evaluate who you might want to reach out to based on how much you think it might cost, I recommend using the $1 per 100 followers rule to kind of estimate what would be appropriate for them to ask from you. Just a quick note about those media kits. I have found that those numbers aren't always hard and fast. So, say that you are reaching out to an influencer who has kind of standardized pricing for, an Instagram story and a feed post, and then a separate pricing structure for something that involves a blog post. You can also work with them to mix and match what you need and negotiate. And that brings us to that final tricky question of what if you can't pay? What if your funding was cut, or you need to prove out your program before you can earn funding? Reevaluate that value proposition, know what you're bringing to the table, and be upfront with your influencers. If that is your situation, it is what it is, and I know influencers will really appreciate not having that sugar-coated, not skirting around the issue. Just let them know up front, this is where we're at as a business, this is what we can offer you, and perhaps, explain that there could be opportunities for compensation in the future and that you're really excited about working with them, and see where that gets you in that conversation. Okay, so kind of the last really fun topic before we dive into metrics is what can you do to get more out of your campaign? I think at a very basic level, when people think about influencer marketing, their immediate associations are just kind of those very static posts on Instagram they scroll past with a little, hashtag that says sponsored. And the truth is that you can get a lot more out of your influencer partnerships than you think. And so I wanted to use Me Jewelry, which is a minimalist online, direct-to-consumer jewelry company as an example, because they have really shown a nice approach to utilizing their influencer content in different ways. So the first one that we can look at is the one on the left, which is using their influencer content and brand ambassador content to enhance their e-com experience. If you look at the studies, user-generated content, which is just made by regular run-of-the-mill consumers, is 5 times more likely to convert when used on a product display page or collection listing page. So you can kind of apply that same logic to your influencer-generated content. So you see the examples above. They're utilizing influencer images to show what their products look like on real people, in real life, and in aspirational kind of aesthetic situations. So adding that to your e-com experience is a really valuable way of extending the life of your influencer content and also getting it to help support that company's bottom line at a higher level. There's also a new-ish feature from Instagram that involves the ability to boost your influencers' content as ads on Instagram. So this requires a little bit of collaboration up front where you'll need to ask your influencer to kind of like accept a request from the brand that will let them boost the ad. But once that setting is toggled, you can then just push their content into an ad format. And from there, I've seen with my own clients really nice returns when it comes to add to cart rate, as well as just growing your organic following. It helps you kind of reach a wider set of audiences, and a lot of them are hooked by the influencer content and then click straight through and follow your brand. So that's something that can really get your brand message to travel far as well. And last but not least, you can use it for SEO. The example I show here actually has not been optimized for a keyword, which is definitely a missed opportunity, but in that picture, the company Me Jewelry used one of their expert influencers, so not necessarily a traditional influencer, but this is a blog post that's featuring a beauty editor for Couture. She's got about 43,000 Instagram followers. They did a feature with her and posted a blog post using her visual content that talks about wearing multiple earrings on one ear. They could have taken this a step further and optimized it for stacked earrings, which I think has about 500 monthly search volume, and that could have helped them increase their search visibility. So just some ideas about how you can think past the initial post or YouTube video and really get that to work from an e-commerce perspective.
Allison, this is a great breakdown of all the different applications or use cases for influencer content and engagement. But my question for you is, do these different approaches dictate or impact the types of metrics that marketers use to measure success? I know you were talking earlier about you know, the use of bots and tools that kind of inflate, you know, traditional metrics like views, comments, things of that nature. So, I mean, there are a lot of things to consider from a measurement standpoint. So would you be able to break down what we should and shouldn't be looking at to gauge success depending on these different approaches and depending on the types of campaigns that brands move forward with?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. So before we move to the next slide, you can kind of look at each of these examples and imagine in your head what kind of KPIs might be attached to each one. Obviously, the number one recommendation from today's talk is to start with your goal or pain point that you're trying to. And so you can see that each of these examples here address a specific pain point or goal. So when you're looking at things like conversion or lead generation or simply traffic, you can start with those KPIs first. So let's dive into how you can zero in on those and what story to tell, what way to present it. We'll go through and show you exactly what this could look like from, you know, an Excel tracking. You know, just remember it's all data and it starts with collection and cleaning. My number one recommendation to everyone getting started with kind of create a spreadsheet, metrics, and track them, collect everything, content performance, and then start to pull things, and I'll show you what I mean by this. Okay, so because you set that goal at the beginning of your campaign, you know what you need to solve, what you need to measure. So the first example here is just showing how you can relay to other people who are interested in seeing, you know, reporting on your campaign, how far your brand message traveled. This is maybe one of the most simple ways of explaining, you know, the impact of your campaign. So you can look at things like followers or reach, impressions, and, you know, referral traffic from your influencer content. This may be from your influencer content, or it might just be a spike that you see in organic social content to the website as a whole during the period of you know, post going live. But this is just one way that you can pull out these metrics and use them to explain, you know, how many people you were able to expose to your brand message, and, you know, how many of those people came full circle and visited the website. The next thing we can look at is engagement. So, you know, whether it's likes or if you're on Facebook and you're measuring reactions, shares, comments, mentions are all great ways to look at, you know, not only who is interacting with the content, but who is showing active interest. And so, you know, when you look at things like reactions, if you're messaging on Facebook, you know, reactions take a lot more effort to apply to posts because they require kind of a different method of selection. So you can kind of measure that as demonstrated interest in the content. But not only that, but looking at, you know, what types of content received more engagement. So not only are you measuring kind of all of your efforts as a whole, but you can use this to pit different types of content against each other. And this is also kind of where you can mold the beginning parts of your process around. So if you are doing something in the food sphere, let's say that you're a supplement that has a powder that can be mixed into, you know, beverages and food. Maybe you want to test whether or not a picture with a model holding the product performs better than recipe content. So, you know, you can go into your influencer engagements knowing that you want to create this different kind of content, and at the very end, you can use these metrics to kind of measure performance against each other to see what's most effective. There's also the question of lead generation, and this is where you can use Google Analytics to your advantage. Keep in mind the period of time in which your content's going live, and you can take a look kind of at a higher level of, you know, how much traffic organic search was sending to your website. And while you may not be able to, you know, specifically parse how many people are coming from your influencer content, if you notice a spike during this period, it's safe to assume that it is coming from your efforts on your organic social platforms. And the stuff will be sent out after, so, you know, there's some more detailed information in here of how you can go about finding this and collecting those numbers, so definitely refer back to this if you need a reference. after this webinar. And lastly, conversions. I definitely recommend using promo codes, unique promo codes, and UTMs per your influencers so that you can, one, track where your sales and traffic are coming from, and also be able to evaluate which influencers are working well for you and which ones you might want to gently part ways with. You know, a brand is only as good as its, you know, success measurement model, and so you definitely need to be continuing to audit not only just the engagement that your influencers are receiving, what kind of content people are reacting to, but also which influencers you like to work with. So one of your major takeaways at the end of a campaign is figuring out who are your star players and maybe who was a little bit more challenging to work with or didn't kind of deliver up to what you were hoping. So these are just some metrics that you can use to kind of tell a finer story of the impact of your influencer marketing campaign after it's over.
Great. There's great stuff in here, Allison. I feel like we could talk about like the measurement and the ROI side all day because there are so many layers to that. So thank you for sharing that high level. And like you said, this deck will be available to everyone so they can kind of go back and refer to this almost as a playbook of sorts. But let's get into some examples because I'm sure everyone on the line is clamoring to see what brands, you know, in different categories have really done this well. So which ones really rise to the top for you and why?
That's the most exciting part of the conversation to me, Alicia, is just kind of seeing who's doing it well and seeing some real life examples. So I have 3 brand examples that I'd like to share with you today of brands that really go above and beyond when it comes to their influencer marketing campaigns and excel in very specific ways. So I want to start with Yeti. They have a very robust brand ambassador program. You don't really see a lot of traditional influencer style marketing from them. They are, you know, an outdoor brand that, you know, they want to speak to performance and they want to speak to, brand evangelists who are kind of movers and shakers in, you know, that kind of outdoor arena, whether it's, competitive fly fishers or mountain climbers or people that road trip. So if you visit the Yeti Ambassador site, and I highly recommend you do just to explore it, you'll see a myriad of voices from skiers to Olympic fly fishers to snowboarders. And so you have some examples here of the different content they've created. So you have that example at the lower left from Flip Palette, who helps create content for Yeti and talks about, bringing the coolers with him on his fly fishing trips. You also see content that's geared more towards Instagram. You can also see content that's geared towards Instagram in a stay-home kind of era at home with Robin Van Dien, who's a professional snowboarder. So you've got a shorter format video that they've created with her. And then in the picture in the upper right of that truck, was created by a well-known outdoor photographer who they collaborated with to create kind of more dynamic imagery to place on their e-com site. So, authenticity is kind of their #1 card that they want to play when working with influencers. They don't want just anybody talking about the product, but they want people who are interacting with it in kind of a high-stakes environment that pertains to their outdoor hobbies. Whole Foods is another great example. I think they're incredibly relevant right now as brands struggle with the concept of, how to build faith and trust in the in-store experience. And I think Whole Foods, has just historically done a great job with that. You see some examples here where they've worked with local influencers, micro-influencers, to kind of document their shopping experience in-store and the hauls of what they bring home. I also think it's interesting that they collaborate not just with kind of, local mom micro-influencers and student influencers, but they also work with local chefs to see like what's in their basket. So that's an example of them leaning on different voices from influencers to brand ambassadors to experts I guess if you're talking about a chef, they kind of straddle that line between expert and creative. But not only that, but they work with their employees to tell stories about their staff, to kind of give consumers a better idea of the community that they're buying into and the values that they're aligning themselves with when they shop at Whole Foods. So the example on the right is an Instagram Stories campaign that they've been running about the different people who support the store from the inside. And lastly, Lululemon. I think that this company has not always been historically associated with being inclusive, but the brand has been making amazing strides in this arena. And I really wanted to call out their very smart usage of influencer collaborations to fulfill a variety of needs for the brand. So on the left, you have a piece of shoppable content that's driven by a relationship with a brand ambassador, Charlie Dark, who is a runner. He's also an athlete of color. And on this page, you get some insight into who he is. You also get like a little workout video, and at the bottom, you get to shop his favorites. So, not only are they aligning with, experts in the fitness world, but they're delivering value when it comes to sharing that workout video, but they're also kind of supporting that e-commerce perspective with the shoppable content underneath. And then to the right is a really interesting example of content that Lululemon also created simply to deliver value that is not e-commerce driven to consumers. So if you visit the website, you'll notice a section that has been created in partnership with the UN, where they've partnered with kind of different, yoga, mindfulness, and health experts for sessions that are either, guided meditations or conversations that they can listen into about self-care topics. And they definitely demonstrate a mastery of diversity and inclusion with the personalities that they're engaging on site, which I think is a really forward-thinking, at this point, practice for a brand. I think many brands are just catching up to that concept now. So if you visit Lululemon, you can see them do that really well on their page. And so that kind of leads to the end of what I wanted to share with everyone today. I know you're submitting questions, and please continue to do that. We'll get to questions in just a second. If you have any questions about kind of my further perspective on things and want to chat a little bit more deeply about your brand and your brand's needs, please don't hesitate to reach out via my contact information. And I really, really appreciate everyone joining me today.
Great. Allison, thank you again so much for this extremely detailed and insightful conversation. I know influencer marketing has been a buzz phrase, a hot topic for a while, especially in retail, but really getting down to the brass tacks of, what are the steps we need to follow to ensure success? How can we ensure that we're looking at this holistically and strategically as a business, especially in these times, I think is extremely valuable. So thank you so much for getting down into the weeds with us today. We did actually go quite a bit over, but I do want to get into some questions because we're getting some really great ones right now. If for any reason we do not answer your question, don't fret. We'll make sure Allison follows up with you or someone else from the Capgemini team follows up, and then you can have a follow-up conversation online or, have a quick email exchange to get your questions answered. So please do continue to submit those. We'll make sure the appropriate person follows up. I do want to get to a few, though, that I think are especially relevant. So I think, what really resonates with me, Allison, around all of the examples you shared is that, these are different product categories, different value props, but really strong emphasis on authenticity. And I loved, the show us what's in your cart approach for Whole Foods. I love this, this notion of connecting at an emotional level beyond the product. I feel like people are hungry for that now, especially in light of, current circumstances, but then at the end of the day, we also know marketing is marketing, right? So how can brands make these authentic connections, with and through influencers? You know what I mean? So how can it still feel authentic and true to the nature of what good influencer marketing is, especially in light of this new normal where people's sensitivities may be heightened, or they may be feeling a bit more cognizant of the marketing that they're being served in these times?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a delicate dance, right? As you said, marketing is marketing, but brands have been forced to kind of reckon with the human element of who they're marketing to more than ever these days. And so I think my number one tip would just be, instead of starting with, the product highlight or like kind of the company facing goal of your influencer marketing campaign, it's just starting with, what can you deliver of value to your community, and frame your conversation, frame your campaign around that. Refer back to that checklist that I had at the very beginning of questions to ask yourself about your campaign narrative to make sure it's still fitting kind of the current climate, and then just put yourself in the shoes of the consumer and ask what do you need to consume at this point in time, what would land with you, and what do you admire most about what you see other people doing, and start with kind of that community-driven value proposition before you dive into the sell.
That's very helpful. So this next question, I do want to get a bit more tactical with the time we have left. So you spoke a little bit about the fact that there are tools in the marketplace. So this one attendee is asking, what can I expect to get with an influencer marketing tool versus handling the entire process myself? I mean, I'm sure that kind of depends on, maturity of the influencer strategy or what their objectives are, but is there kind of like a have and have not of investing in technology?
That's a great question, and it all kind of comes down to what resources you have available, how much time you have available to run your program. I am of the mind that, marketing tools are really great for streamlining the process somewhat, but they still kind of leave you with the need to do the legwork to find the right influencers. So what a tool gives you access to is kind of more just instant access to metrics like engagement rates, follower counts. It'll give you information about previous and current brand partnerships, and some even have kind of built-in tools for giving their content a rating or authenticity score. It can also manage workflow. So when you think about all these things like evaluating influencers, finding them, and managing kind of the conversation between them, these are all things that you are able to do on your own without the tool, but perhaps you only have one resource on your team who is new to influencer marketing and needs the guidance, and you happen to have a budget that can support the use of a tool. They can be expensive sometimes, but this would be a great option if that's kind of the situation you're in. I generally advocate a more kind of old-fashioned, bespoke method where you are looking up, the proper tags or associated brands and seeing who they're working with and kind of doing your own research. And to speak to things like engagement rate, we're finding that we can rely less and less on automated tools to judge that for you. You really do need that human eye. So if you have the time and you have the resource, or you are willing to work with an agency who does this themselves for you, then I would definitely recommend taking that more human approach to managing that relationship with them.
Yeah, that's a great point, that it all kind of goes back to machines are great, but there is still, because it is such a relationship-driven, a human-driven strategy or tactic, it really does require the human eye, some level of human judgment and assessment, because at the end of the day, your brand, your customers better than anyone else. So you really kind of need to do that due diligence and make sure that, you're not trying to build these relationships that, ultimately are misaligned with what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because that's really the heart of, a good strategy. So I think that's a great closing point to that topic. And sadly, the closing point to our conversation today. Alex, I feel like because we're both so passionate about this topic, we can go hours and hours about it and just continue to field questions. But sadly, we do have to end things today. Thank you again so much for taking the time out to speak with me. We are going to make sure that anyone who did submit a question and didn't get an answer, we are going to make that connection for you, make sure you get your questions answered. So keep those coming. We'll make sure, everyone feels satisfied and prepared to dig into influencer marketing within their organization. So I'll thank you again so much again for this fantastic and very detailed presentation today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And of course, thanks to everyone out there for watching. If you want to see more fantastic insights from our peers, partners, and other influencers and experts in the retail realm, please do visit the Retail Reset Hub and content experience for all kinds of resources, from webinars like this to videos, articles, Q&As, podcasts, the whole nine, everything you need to set a path for success moving forward. As always, thank you again so much for turning to Retail Touchpoints for news and insights, and have a great day, everyone. We'll see you next time.